Okay, so I want to do a video on the monarchy. I am a monarchist, and that's what I want to do a video on. And I know it's going to raise the hackles of a few people, Republicans within the United Kingdom. That's immediately going to raise the hackles somewhat. So this could be quite an interesting video. It comes on the back of a couple of videos that I made with regard to the United States and guns, which raised a couple of issues, and it became clear to me that some of the naiveties and misunderstandings that I had with regard to the USA, that the same kind of things apply the other way round. And so I wanted to clear a few of those things up, and although I'm not going to touch on some of the constitutional issues, which would be quite interesting to talk about, how our constitution, well, we don't really have a constitution, but how our system of government works, I should say. I'm not really going to do that. What I want to talk about is why I think we should maintain a monarchy, and then talk about some of the checks and balances that the monarchy gives us that perhaps we wouldn't have if we didn't have a monarchy, and they'd need to be replaced with something else. So that's what I want to talk about. What I ought to do first is just to clear a few things up about what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about. The first thing that I would say is that obviously by dint of this being a sort of pro-monarchy video, that is going to have some anti-Republican sentiment. It is going to include some fairly robust criticism of Republican positions. Now, what I would say is don't be offended by that, right? That is your opportunity, if you are a Republican, to come back at me and to say, well, no, actually, I think you've misrepresented me there, or you've misrepresented us there, or this is how I'd actually see things panning out. And this is how I would advocate the Republican position. So that's the first thing that I would say there. The next thing that I would say is to remind you that this only applies to the United Kingdom. It doesn't apply to other countries around the world, including other constitutional monarchies. Some of the arguments I make may well apply to all constitutional monarchies, or at least to the other 15 countries that Queen Elizabeth II is also the head of state of. But I'm not making an advocacy position with regard to that. What I would also say with regard to the Republicans, of course, is that in one way you have the cards stacked in your favour, is that you only really have to get a majority of people on your side within the United Kingdom once, maybe for a few years, but once, and we'll end up switching. We'll have a vote and we'll end up switching to a republic, and that's always going to be a path of no return at this point, I think, in history. So you've only ever got to win that battle once. That's what's in your favour. What's in my favour, what's in the monarchist's favour, is at the moment you only have 17% of people, according to the most recent polls, who favour us switching over to a republic. Something that you might not gather looking at online conversations. You might seem to think that a lot more people in the United Kingdom favour being in a republic. It's actually quite a low number there. The next point that I want to make is, please, if you live in the United States of America, do not confuse what I am talking about by republicanism with the Republican Party and people who vote for the Republican Party. I know that sounds mind-shatteringly obvious, but I just know that if I don't say this, I'm going to get comments from people thinking I'm criticising Republicans in the United States. There are certainly issues that I would criticise Republicans in the United States for, but it's absolutely nothing to do with the contents of this video. In fact, most Republicans in the United Kingdom, the great majority of Republicans in the United Kingdom, are way to the political left, whereas, of course, the Republican Party in the United States is the right-wing party there. The last thing that I would say, just in this little preamble here, is that in no way am I advocating monarchy as a system of government. If you were starting afresh, right, there's no way I would say, well, what you want to plump for is some kind of constitutional monarchy. That's not what I'm saying at all. That would be a really bizarre thing to set up afresh, to decide that somebody is going to be the monarch and then their children will inherit the status as head of state. Very bizarre in the extreme. And if you have a functioning republic, in no way am I suggesting that you should get rid of that. In fact, you will see from the arguments that I make are largely based upon the value of tradition and how that impacts upon how we feel, the kind of ownership we take of the political process and the gravitas it adds towards the political process, that is the last thing that I would suggest, that you would switch from an established republic and go to a monarchy. Okay, so just to set that out there. The next thing I want to do is to concede the ideological point to the Republicans. Yes, of course, from that ideological level, it is superior to elect someone through a democratic process than it is to have a head of state. So to have President Blair, which is what I'm going to talk about in this video, I'll always refer to President Blair because I just think that Tony Blair is the kind of guy that would have stepped into that role, and I actually think he'd probably done quite a good job of that role, as it turns out. It might not be President Blair, it might be President Boris Johnson, it might even be President Ken Livingstone. Who knows who you would end up with? Okay, but obviously from a democratic perspective, that is ideologically more sound. And if you are an ideologue, and by an ideologue I mean somebody who places ideological values above practical realities about how things actually pan out, then I probably don't have very much to offer you. The arguments that I give aren't going to matter really, because it doesn't matter how well the system functions to you. What matters to you as an ideologue is that you have the most ideologically sound procedures underpinning what you do. I accept that. I'm not even going to debate that. But for the rest of us, I think there's some really interesting discussions to have. Not just for people in the United Kingdom, in fact, in some ways, perhaps more interesting for people who live in other countries. Maybe because they won't have heard some of these arguments, although there's a lot of people in the United Kingdom probably haven't really thought about a lot of the arguments from both sides. But also if you live in a different constitutional monarchy, to compare the arguments that you would have with the discussions that we have. Now, one of the ones I didn't want to bring up was these tired old fucking one of finances, though I suppose I have to discuss that to some extent because Republicans always bring it up. Maybe first just discuss the typical defence of the monarchist position is this one about tourism. I don't like it as a defence because however much we bring in from tourism, it's not really, you don't choose a head of state based on fucking tourism. But if you're going to bring the finances up, I don't think that you can avoid the tourism thing. Personally, I just don't think you should bring the finances up on either side because it's really, that's not what you base it on, the fucking finances. But if you're going to bring the finances up, tourism is an issue. The Republican argument is there might be a lot of income generated tourism-wise by the monarchy, but that would exist even if we got rid of the monarchy. They could still have a look at the crown jewels, couldn't they? But the point is that the crown jewels are functioning items, that if a new monarchy is crowned, that they will be wearing the I think it's the imperial state crown at the state opening of Parliament. The Queen wears the imperial state crown. The maces that are there, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, our lower and upper chambers, cannot sit. They cannot be in session unless that mace is there. That gives them their authority. These are actual living items that form part of our democracy. They're not just sort of relics of history, and I think that gives them an extra vibrancy and makes them a lot more relevant, and I think that increases their sort of tourism worth, if you like. But the Republican argument, the thing that's always really got under the skin of Republicans has been the civil list, the fact that we pay the Queen money to do her job as head of state. That's the kind of thing that they really cannot stand. It's as if I always sort of get the feeling, where does President Blair stand in this? Are we not going to pay him anything? You know, we had President Xi Jinping, the Chinese president recently, and he was tickled pink. And by all accounts, his nation was tickled pink. The second biggest economy in the world was tickled pink that their president had the full red carpet treatment, right? They had a full state banquet in his name. Okay, the fucking works. What do you want President Blair to do in his drab grey suit? You know, drive around in a Ford Fiesta, take President Xi Jinping for a fucking kebab and chips. Obviously, let's not spare any expense. It'll be a full mixed kebab, bit of chip spice on the chips, maybe a can of Diet Coke chucked in there, you know, as well. I mean, what do you expect? Is this not money well spent, you know, spending that money on a head of state? But the civil list always rankled with them, and they always wanted to see the civil list scrapped or at least largely amended, but they never really followed that through, I didn't think, in a very fair way, because how was the civil list created? Well, it was created originally after the Civil War, but it really took its present form, I think, with George III. He was having a few difficulties financially, and the system evolved. We have the Crown Estates, which are part of the Crown. It's part of the sovereign's property. It's not the personal property of the reigning monarch, but it is the property that they hold as part of the crown. And they would get the money from the Crown Estates, and then they could spend it on all these things. And what we said was, okay, well, we'll pay for all these functions you were paying for, clear your debts and pay you these civil list payments, but we get all this fucking wonga from the Crown Estates. And over the years, the money that the Crown Estates has made has dwarfed the money that we've spent on the civil list. So we'll scrap the civil list, but we're not going to give back the money from the Crown Estates. No, we're not going to do any of that. Well, of course, we have a different arrangement now than we have for the last few years, whereas the Queen, the Queen effectively gets, I think it's 15% of the money, the profit that the Crown Estates makes each year. I think that's a pretty good arrangement. Why should she get all of it back? After all, we did pay her debts in the past. And 15% was kind of set to keep it level with what was there on the civil list. So maybe that's formed a more agreeable position there. But the finances aren't really an issue for me, and I think it's a bit poor. Whatever we have, even if we have a presidential system, we need to invest enough money into that office of president, even if they're just a ceremonial president, or if they have the kind of reserve powers that the Queen has at the moment. Right, we need to invest to do a decent job of it. We don't want to look like total twats on an international stage, do we? Surely we want to be able to hold our heads up high there, not just do every single fucking thing on the cheap. Now, to actually get onto the arguments that I want to make, the arguments that I'm making this video to make, the first is that I think the Republicans often look at the wrong examples when they consider us being a republic. And they tend to look at the great republics. You know, you look at places like the United States with their two centuries plus of continuous republic and this great tradition that they have and this great commitment they have towards the republic, or to another great republic like France, which hasn't had the same continuity of republic and has had a few problems with its republican system, but still has this same great commitment and this same great pride in the fact that it's a republic, and they see us being another version of that. But those things, it seems to me, are very much based upon tradition. And if you start a republic now, that isn't what we end up with. What we end up with is a very drab and dull, grey-suited version, which is bereft of tradition, because that is not the tradition we have. Our tradition is tied up in the system we have at present. And what you're actually suggesting is, let's just eschew all that tradition, do away with all of that, and therefore have something that has none of those qualities that these great republics have. After all, a lot of the exchanges that I had on the guns videos that I mentioned, it was very clear that a lot of Americans, regardless of their position on that issue, feel a great sense of investment and a great sense of gravitas towards the Constitution and towards their republic, that has surely only grown because it has been in situ for as long as it has. That really is part of what gives them that investment that they have, that they're part of something that stretches back just over a couple of centuries now, and I can well understand how that feels. I think we can all understand that. But that isn't something that you can just cut out of fresh cloth. That is something that develops over a period of time. So you can't suddenly start a republic and expect to start on that. Most republics, when they start, are much shakier, and one of the reasons they're shaky is because they haven't had time to mature, and because I propose there isn't that same investment that comes from something having been in situ for a long period of time. The other thing to consider with regards to that is that the type of republic that we have would be very different. Of course, the USA has a full presidential system. The French system has a kind of mishmash system that's evolved over the years, really, a semi-presidential system. The system that we would have, systems that have a parliamentary monarchy that end up becoming a republic through peaceful means, end up becoming a parliamentary republic. So the kind of way you want to be casting your gaze is something more along the lines of Ireland, where they replace what was, well, in Ireland's case, the Queen. They replace an hereditary monarch with an elected president who has largely the same powers and largely the same status as our present Queen, or less. They may have an entirely ceremonial role and actually no executive powers whatsoever. So you're talking about something that is very, very different from the systems that you would see in France and the USA, for starters. And so in terms of the benefits that you see, you have to put that in terms of the model that is actually going to be applied. And effectively what you have is exactly the same system we have now, It's just that the personhood of the Queen is replaced by the personhood of Tony Blair or Boris Johnson or Ken Livingstone, and that we get to vote for a different one every 4 years or 5 years or what have you. Now, from an ideological perspective, that trumps everything else, then that's maybe a model that you would want to go to. But let me discuss the checks and balances, right? Because we have certain checks and balances within our system which largely revolve around the reserve powers that the Queen has, which often the government exercises on her behalf through royal prerogative, but she still has those powers. By convention, Parliament may exercise them on her behalf, or her government exercises them on her behalf, I should say, but she still has those reserve powers, which the expectation is that she would only use them unilaterally, or under consultation with her advisors in times of grave constitutional crisis. But what would happen if you was to replace her with an elected president? Well, what I would suggest to you, and I'll talk about some of those checks and balances and whether I think that actually the trick would actually work right at the end of this video, but what I suggest to you is we'd need to have a real think on those checks and balances and replace them with something else, because the checks and balances that we have intrinsically rely upon our head of state being apolitical and the fate of the head of state not being tied up within party politics. Now, would we replace them with different checks and balances? I don't know whether we would. I think we'd probably just kind of mumble on with what we had and just replace the Queen with an elected equivalent. Now, why I suggest, and this might seem a really odd suggestion, you might think, how can there possibly be some advantage towards having an unelected head of state rather than an elected head of state? Let me explain why. What is in the interests of the Queen? If the Queen is interested in maintaining her position as head of state, and in maintaining that to something that she can pass down to Prince Charles and Prince William, what does that depend upon? Well, it depends upon how we view her as an individual, and it depends upon how we view the institution of the monarchy. And those things really, what is the critical factor with regard to those? If the Queen is interested in maintaining those, the best thing that she can do, the very best thing that she can do, is act in accordance with the will of the people. If she acts in accordance with the will of the people, then we hold her in high regard and we hold the monarchy in high regard. In fact, she only has to fuck up once, really, on a constitutional issue, refuse to give royal assent to a bill when she's no business not to, and it would really form a constitutional crisis and might throw us into a republic. So she can't afford to fuck up on that. But what about instead if we consider if we had President Blair, if we shift over from a parliamentary monarchy to a parliamentary republic, and we've got Tony Blair there? Well, of course, the two factors that's going to be key there is how we feel about Tony Blair himself and how we feel about the Labour Party, because he's intrinsically linked to the Labour Party. He's next leader of the Labour Party. Same as if we had President Johnson, he would intrinsically be linked to the fate and how we feel about the Conservative Party. So we've got a very big difference there, haven't we? Because now we have somebody with political allegiances. Of course, if you come from a country that has a presidential or semi-presidential system, you're going to think, well, why does that matter? Because obviously they're going to have political allegiances. That's why you voted them in, because of those political allegiances. But of course, in those kinds of systems, the powers, the executive powers that are wielded by the president are political in nature. The reserve powers that we have in our system are only powers that you really expect to be wielded in times of grave constitutional crisis, and they are apolitical in nature. You want them to be wielded at a level that looks beyond party politics and just takes into account what is good for the constitution, what is good for the democracy of the country. And what is going to deal with the situation that is developing. So I think that's very, very important there. And I think you can see, therefore, that President Blair, we would be relying on President Blair not necessarily acting in his best interests or the interests of his party, but acting in good faith. Do I think President Blair would act in good faith? Probably would, President Blair. I think he's generally a pretty decent chap. I think that's what he would do. He'd do the right thing. Would the Queen do the right thing? Yeah, I think she probably would as well. But here's the key difference, folks, is that it relies on President Blair acting in good faith. Even if the Queen doesn't want to act in good faith, even if she wants to act in her best interests and the interests of the monarchy and the interests of her son and her grandson and them becoming future kings, she's still going to make the same decision because she's going to act in line with the will of the people, and the will of the people are going to be, please deal with this grave constitutional situation that has developed, right? So this is the difference, and that's why I think in this particular circumstance it's actually an advantage to have an unelected head of state. And if you're going to have an elected head of state, you would need a different set of checks and balances, because the set of checks and balances we have would not be appropriate at the moment. I'm concerned that we wouldn't alter those checks and balances. I wanted to talk about tradition. I said about the importance of tradition in these things. I've often viewed a lot of what happens with regard to the pomp and pageantry as bullshit with regard to the United Kingdom. Good bullshit. We do bullshit really well. That kind of pomp stuff we do as well as anybody. And it is kind of nice. And it is part of what makes us the country that we are, right? And I've always had a fondness for it, but I've always seen it as somehow superficial. And it was when I turned about 30 that I actually watched the state opening of Parliament properly for the first time, watched the whole thing all the way through, and listened to what was being said rather than just watching the pictures. And I started to see how the whole thing is tied in with our history and how significant it is. And it touched me, right? It made me feel more committed to our democracy and to the process that we have than it had before I knew about all those things. And it made me consider how I would feel if I was a new MP, and how that would impact on me, observing those things actually as a part of it rather than just watching it on the television. If you're not familiar with the state opening of Parliament, the state opening of Parliament happens when the Queen forms a new government, or each year, right, when Parliament opens each year for a new session. And what happens in shorthand is the Queen goes to the House of Lords and she says what her government is going to do. Now, she doesn't decide what's in there. The government writes it for her. Her government then writes it for her, and she says this is what the government is going to do. She doesn't have any say in what's in there. She can't just put at the end of it, buy Queenie a nice present, okay? She doesn't get any fucking say in any of that, okay? But the long form of it, the whole thing is full of little bits of history. One of the first things that she does is that she sends some of her guards to the Houses of Parliament to check out the cellars, to check there's no modern day equivalent of Guy Fawkes planting any kegs of gunpowder under there to try and blow every fucker up, because it would be a great time to blow people up. Everybody's there. And the other thing that she does, get this is proper, I read this on a newspaper thing, they said this is proper fucking Game of Thrones territory, and it really is. She takes a hostage. Get that? She takes a fucking hostage. A member of Parliament from the House of Commons, because that's always where the tension's been, the monarchy in the House of Commons, right, which is usually one of the government whips, goes to Buckingham Palace and stays at Buckingham Palace until the Queen makes a safe return back to Buckingham Palace. Obviously not entirely necessary, but it makes you think back to those times, centuries gone by, where it wasn't necessarily a given that the Queen would escape from the Houses of Parliament in one piece, and so they wanted some kind of bargaining arrangement there to make sure the Queen got safe passage, or the monarch got safe passage back out again. So she takes a hostage. She then sets off to the Houses of Parliament, to the Palace of Westminster, from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster. Actually, the Houses of Parliament are a state residence, although the Queen never stays there. So she heads off to the Palace of Westminster, and that's where you get all the pomp and bullshit, and it looks absolutely fantastic. She's there in a marvellous horse-drawn golden carriage, picks one of them, and then you have these lifeguards behind her with those beautiful brass hats with little tassels, and it all looks absolutely regal and beautiful, and it's all part of the process. But when she gets there, there's a lot of history tied up in every little step, and I won't go through each step. It's worth watching the whole thing if you're interested in. But when she gets there, she goes to the robing room, puts on all the regalia, puts on a crown, makes her way to the House of Lords, where she sits in her throne, right? Because she has a permanent seat in the House of Lords, and she can sit in that throne. That is our upper chamber, right? The House of Lords. She doesn't go into the House of Commons. Why? Because she's not allowed to go into the House of Commons. The last monarch that went in the House of Commons was Charles I to try and arrest some of the MPs, and that didn't end very well. It ended in civil war. Okay, that is one of the few rights, by the way, that I have that the Queen doesn't have. There's plenty of rights that the Queen has that I don't have. She doesn't have to have a driving licence. She doesn't have to have a... This is a good one. She doesn't have to have... The Queen doesn't have to have a passport, right? So if you're in a foreign country and the Queen's visiting, everybody else has a passport. Often you'll have a diplomatic passport. The President of the United States has a diplomatic passport. If the Queen comes to visit you, she doesn't have a passport. The reason she doesn't have a passport, get this is kind of like a sort of Chuck Norris thing. Chuck Norris doesn't have a passport, he issues the passports. Well, that's what the Queen does. She doesn't have a passport, she issues the passports. So the logic, and I'm not calling it logic, right? But the logic behind it is the Queen doesn't need a passport, because if you want to know if she's the Queen, just ask her and she can vouch for herself. It's the kind of logic of the Bible, isn't it? Well, how do you know your God's the one true God? Well, because he says he is. You know, I don't really buy it, I've got to say. I don't buy it with regard to the claims that the religious make, and I don't buy it with regard to the Queen there. But anyway, that's a little thing there. Having said that, if you can manage to smuggle yourself into a country by pretending to be the Queen, if you can set up an entire royal visit with all the fucking trimmings, right, just so that you can smuggle yourself into the country pretending to be Queen Elizabeth II, who is probably one of the most recognised people in the world, that's a pretty fucking good effort, I've got to say. I think you deserve to get in without a passport, to be honest, there. But she doesn't need a passport, but she cannot enter the House of Commons. So this is what happens as part of the system, is that she sends Black Rod. And no, that's not Black Rod, by the way. That's you're getting the wrong idea. This gentleman here is Black Rod. It's the gentleman usher of the Black Rod, and she sends him to the House of Commons to summon the Commons through to the Lords so that she can present what her government is going to do. And what happens when Black Rod gets to the Houses of Parliament? The chamber of the House of Commons, I should say, is that they slam the door in his face. And the reason that they slam the door in his face is because it signifies the independence of the House of Commons, that the monarch cannot boss about what happens in the House of Commons. That is beyond her remit there. Okay? So there's a lot of constitutional significance, and that stems back to the time of the Civil War. That is the House of Commons showing their independence. And then what happens next, which I find, which isn't talked about as much, but touches me, when I saw it, it touched me more than anything else. We have a very confrontational system. The Westminster system that we have is a very confrontational system. And unlike these kind of hemicircular chambers that most countries have, where you sit round in a nice arc, it's just two rows of benches that fucking face each other, and you're on the government or you're the opposition, and you just glare at each other. Very, very confrontational. But this is a case where the confrontation is put to one side, right? And it's kind of a really nice moment there, because what happens is, and I'll show you the footage of this perhaps in a minute, is that Black Rod goes in there, he announces, summons them all, and then they all start to traipse out. Obviously, the sergeant-in-arms takes the mace. You don't want to lose that fucking mace, whatever you do. Otherwise, you can't sit. I assume the Queen's got her room somewhere with a load of fucking spare maces, perhaps. But you have to have that mace. So the mace comes out. But then, this is the key thing. They all pair up, okay? The Prime Minister pairs up with the Leader of the Opposition, and everybody pairs up, and they're all fucking mates, right? Because just for this one moment in the parliamentary year, the House of Commons is united. It's the House of Commons, the House of Lords, the monarchy, the judiciary are represented in there. They used to be represented as part of the House of Lords. They're independent now, but they're still represented as part of the process. And as is, some people, members of the military, will be represented as part of it. So they're representing the House of Commons, and they chat away. And there's some marvellous messages with all of that. Let me just show you the whole process here.
Black Rod approaching the Commons.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this Honourable House to attend Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will legislate in the interests of everyone in our country.
Okay, so I edited that down to give you a bit of an example of what that's all about. I cannot help think that when I watched that, that impacted on me, okay? Even though I was already well committed to our democracy, etc. But that impacted on me. It made me realise that what I thought was a very superficial process actually is full of little messages and little historical lessons. And it impacted on me. I can't help but feel it would impact all the more if you're a Member of Parliament. A new Member of Parliament may be seeing it for the first or second time. And all of a sudden it will dawn on you the weight of history that underpins the thing that you have now become a part of. And I think that that's very, very important, even if you're a Republican, by the way. And I have respect for Republicans. I've already conceded the ideological argument to them. Might disagree with them. But even if you're a Republican, surely if you experience that, you can't help but see that there is some benefit to that continuity of history there and the lessons that underpin it. We talk about the lessons of the Second World War and learning those lessons and not forgetting those lessons. And that's why we have ceremonies relating to the war every year, to stop us forgetting the lessons that we can learn from the Second World War. So many of our constitutional lessons are tied in with things like the state opening of Parliament and tied in with the procedures that Parliament undertakes on a daily basis. And if we shifted from a constitutional monarchy to a constitutional republic, you can't but lose them. You can't keep all this shit and be a republic, right? They have to go because the Queen's gone. And because all the instruments of the Queen has gone and all the instruments of the Crown and of the Sovereign have gone. So I think that's really, really important. And of course the institution of the monarchy holds a lot of possessions in trust for the nation. They're not the Queen's private possessions. They are held in trust by the institution of the monarchy and can only pass from monarch to monarch on behalf of the nation and are thereby held in trust and held separate from the state, and so the state can't dispose of them or do anything that we wouldn't like with them. And you could understand why the state would. I mean, things like the crown jewels, for example. We're not fucking about with regard to jewels here. The imperial state crown is the second largest cut diamond in the world. The sceptre of the cross has the largest cut diamond in the world. You know, these are serious fucking jewels that we're talking about here. I'm sure they'd raise quite a bit of revenue for the government's coffers if the government could sell these kinds of things off. So I think that's quite a nice arrangement we have with that. What I really wanted to talk about was the checks and balances that we have, and whether those checks and balances would actually work. If you could make the trick work as a monarch, and I think that you could. Now let me first say that there's no ultimate answer to this. If you listen to it's always interesting to listen to constitutional experts within the United Kingdom, of which of course I am not one, right? But if you listen to constitutional experts within the United Kingdom, they can't agree on things. And that's part of the system that we have, is that a lot of it is open to interpretation. We don't have a written constitution for a start. We've just kind of made shit up as we go along. We just make legislation that takes over from preceding legislation. A lot of what takes place in our system is as a result of convention and therefore goodwill and public acceptance. And so these are very, very important factors in how the system works. And you need to get your head around that to understand the system. Well, the monarch has certain powers, certain reserve powers, executive powers. She's not simply a ceremonial head of state. And the question is whether or not in times of a grave constitutional crisis, which is the thought behind the system, would it stick? Would you be able to make those powers stick? Or would we just all kind of ignore the whole thing? I think that it would stick, right? But if you ask constitutional experts, you'll get as many different answers as you ask constitutional experts. That's one of the kind of fun things about our system. Perhaps it's one of the weaknesses of our system is that it's slightly muddy, but it's perhaps also one of the strengths. It's very difficult to find a loophole in the system where nobody's quite sure exactly what the system is and what will stick and what isn't. You have every chance that because it's muddy that you're going to get caught in that mud somewhere. Because so much of the system relies upon goodwill, it relies upon public opinion, and it relies upon convention. So what are some of these reserve powers that she has? Well, there's quite a number of reserve powers that she has, but I think some of the key ones, one that she lost was the ability to dissolve Parliament. We now have fixed term elections, and I think in a certain sense she should have kept that. I'll maybe describe that in a minute when I discuss a situation that happened in Australia in 75, but she's lost the ability to dissolve Parliament, but she still has the ability both to appoint and to dismiss a government. She also has the ability to refuse to give Queen's consent to any act of Parliament that would impact upon royal prerogative, which are quite a number. You'd have to look that up if you want to see all the things that covers. But more importantly, she has to give royal assent to any act of Parliament whatsoever. She has to sign off any act of Parliament whatsoever. That is important. Another thing that is important is that the armed forces swear their allegiance to the monarch as well. Or at least the army and the Royal Air Force swear their allegiance to the monarch. Not to the state, not to the government, but to the head of state, to the monarchy. The Royal Navy don't, but that's because the Royal Navy was not created from an act of Parliament. The Royal Navy was created directly by a monarch way back in the day. And so effectively it is the monarch's navy, and so they don't swear allegiance, but their tie with the monarch is even greater in many ways than the army and the Air Force. So these are very important things. Another important thing about the Queen is that the Queen cannot break the law, or at least if she does break the law, she can't be tried in any capacity. The smart feeling amongst constitutional experts with regard to that is if the Queen was to stab someone to death, she'd probably be forced to abdicate, and then under those circumstances she'd be tried. But it's still a very important thing, because if you wanted to try and sideline the monarchy by accusing them of something they haven't done, it's impossible to sideline the monarchy, because the principle of monarchy is that there is always a monarch. As soon as the Queen, the moment the Queen dies or the moment the Queen abdicates, the next in line becomes the monarch. So there's no way that you can sideline the institution of the monarchy and an individual as a monarch, because there's always somebody, another monarch springs up straight away. So I think that's quite important, that you can't prosecute the monarch whilst they're a monarch there. But with regard to these other things, would they work? Well, unfortunately, it's very difficult for me to give you an example in the United Kingdom, because we haven't had the kind of constitutional crisis, touch wood, even though I'm not sure that this is actually genuinely wood I'm touching, we won't have one to put these things to the test. But there are countries where they've been put to the test. In Australia, there are just a couple of examples, and I'm sure people from these countries could tell you a lot more about them and how they went down than I can. But in Australia in 1975, there was a big constitutional issue there. And what happened is the Governor-General, of course, the Queen is the head of state in Australia, but the Governor-General performs the Queen's duties in front of the Queen. The Governor-General dismissed the government at the time of a matter that I won't go into, and I only partly understand. But he dismissed the Prime Minister at the time, appointed the Leader of the Opposition, immediately pushed through the legislation which really should have been going through, as I understand it, immediately pushed it through and then dissolved the Parliament, right? Dissolve the Parliament to then do the constitutionally right thing and allow the people of Australia to decide what happened from then on. Now, people will debate, and I'm sure Australians will reply to this and say, I think the Governor-General did the right thing. I think the Governor-General did the wrong thing in dismissing Whitlam as Prime Minister. What I'm damn sure he did the right thing is, having done that, then dissolve it. So then dissolving the Parliament was absolutely the right thing to do, given however you think about the preceding actions, because it then put it straight back into the hands of the people. So those were two of the reserve powers that were used in Australia, and they were used and they worked. Although this does just bring me back to what I was talking about the Queen losing her right to dissolve Parliament. I think this is maybe one situation where it should have been kept, such as that if she dismisses a government, she could then immediately dissolve Parliament. As it stands, with that fixed term bill coming in, she lost that right, but what they added was a right such that if a vote of no confidence is made in a government, then the government has 14 days to get a vote of confidence. If it doesn't get that, then you go to a general election. But what it does mean is if the Queen was to exercise that right in the most extraordinary of circumstances to dismiss a government, you haven't had a vote of no confidence. So she would then have to install the opposition as her government, and then once she'd done that, then Parliament would have to have a vote of no confidence in the opposition that she just installed, and then go to a general election, which seems a somewhat contrived and odd way of going about matters there, but that's how things stand now. Another example of a constitutional monarchy that used its executive power, its reserve powers in that capacity, was the King of Spain in the coup of 1981. He was the head of the armed forces, and following the coup where they'd stormed into the parliament, firing guns in the air, what he did was he went on television dressed in his military regalia as the head of the armed forces, as the person that the armed forces are swearing their allegiance to, and said, I am the head of the armed forces, and this is what the armed forces are going to do. I've spoken with the head of each armed force and instructed them that we're drawing a line. This is not happening anymore, right? And that the rule of the democracy is coming back here. So that was a case where the king played his trick there. The constitutional monarch played their trick, and it worked. So my understanding is in line with what most constitutional experts in the UK would say, which is that it would work. These reserve powers that the Queen has in the terms of grave constitutional crisis would work. The trick would work, but it would work largely because it would be in line with the will of the people. If the Queen was to go maverick and to try and instruct things, if she was to instruct the army to go into Leeds and kill everybody, I'm quite certain that the army would tell her to piss right off, right? But if the government instructed something like that, something abhorrent to happen, then it's the same as what happens the world over. Often what you need is a figurehead, somebody to gather round, right? You often see it in countries that have much less established democracies or much more volatile systems, is that there is one person somewhere that if you could get them in the right place at the right time, that the public and the popular opinion will be able to gather round, and you'll be able to restore some semblance of order in that country. That is what the institution of the Queen represents, but magnified tenfold because of her status, because of the status of the monarchy, that with the will of the people, that I suspect that nearly all of those reserve powers could function in the way that we hope that they would function. But she couldn't abuse them, because without the will of the people, that they would fall flat. I think that's pretty much where the situation is. I hope that I've made a reasonable case for monarchy now. To sum it up, it's based upon tradition and continuity. Without that tradition that we have, and without it being a continuity, I wouldn't advise us to maintain a monarchy. I certainly wouldn't advise any country to have a monarchy cut from fresh cloth. But when you have a system that works for so long, a system that is evolved into the fabric of the country in which it is a part of, and has demonstrably worked well for a long period of time. Of course, people are going to pick and say, oh yes, our system doesn't work, there's this, there's that. You find me a country in the world where people aren't doing that all the time. Of course they are. But by and large, it's been a robust system that has allowed for robust debate and for a robust democracy over centuries. And I really don't see the point of screwing that up just over what is effectively quite a small ideological principle. I think I've said enough. God alone knows how long this video has gone on for. If you watched all of it, I hope you got something out of it. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.